How one Sherman crew's unauthorized reverse maneuver outflanked 3 Panzer IVs at exactly 1:43 in the afternoon on November 9, 1944. Staff Sergeant Michael Kozlowski sat cramped in the driver's seat of an M4 Sherman tank, designated Iron Maiden, in the dense, fog-choked hellscape of the Hurtgen Forest, Germany. Watching through his narrow periscope as 3 German Panzer IV tanks emerged from the tree line approximately 400 yards ahead, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he followed the authorized procedures outlined in the U.S. Army's Field Manual for Armored Vehicle Operations, every single man in his 5-person crew would be dead within the next 3 minutes. The Hurtgen Forest in November 1944 was not a battlefield. It was a meat grinder, a nightmare of mud and shattered trees and German defensive positions that had already killed thousands of American soldiers. And now Kozlowski's tank crew found themselves isolated, cut off from their platoon, with no radio contact because the dense forest and hills blocked transmissions. No artillery support because the forward observers couldn't see through the fog and vegetation, and no chance of retreat because the narrow forest trail behind them was blocked by a destroyed American half-track that had hit a mine 20 minutes earlier. My name is Sergeant Dean, and what I am about to tell you is a story that never made it into the official after-action reports. A story about 5 men who survived an impossible situation, not because they followed the rules, but because they broke them. A story about a tank maneuver that the Army had explicitly forbidden in their training manuals, because it was considered too dangerous and tactically unsound. And a story about how sometimes the difference between living and dying is knowing when to ignore everything your superior officers taught you and trust your own instincts. And the hard one, knowledge that comes from growing up poor and learning to improvise solutions when you don't have the right tools or resources. Let me back up 3 days to explain how Iron Maiden ended up alone in that forest facing 3 Panzer IVs. Because this wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. This was the result of a series of command decisions made by officers who were sitting in warm headquarters buildings, looking at maps that didn't reflect the reality of what was happening on the ground. Officers who had never driven a tank through dense forest or fought in a kind of close-range armor combat, where you could literally see the faces of the enemy crew through your periscope before one of you died. On November 6, 1944, the 2nd Armored Division received orders to support the infantry's push through the Hürtgen Forest toward the town of Schmidt, which sounds simple enough on a map, but which in reality meant trying to maneuver 30-ton tanks through terrain that was never designed for armored warfare, through forests so dense that tanks couldn't traverse between the trees, through mud so deep that vehicles got stuck and became easy targets, through an environment where German troops had spent months preparing defensive positions and laying minefields and pre-sighting their anti-tank guns on every possible avenue of approach. The operational plan, developed by staff officers at division headquarters who relied on aerial photographs and topographical maps, called for armored platoons to advance along specific forest trails that intelligence had identified as passable, providing mobile fire support for the infantry and exploiting any breakthroughs toward Schmidt. But what those staff officers didn't understand, because they had never been on the ground in that forest, was that the trails shown on their maps were little more than logging roads that were now cratered by artillery, blocked by fallen trees, and covered in mud that could swallow a tank up to its tracks.